Welcome back. I'm Buck Sexton, TheBlaze's national security editor. While the Obama administration is playing wait and see on Iraq, there are reports that the Islamic State has taken control of a former chemical weapons plant just north of Baghdad. There are also reports of a mass grave containing 53 bodies that have been discovered just south of the capital city. Now, Iraqi officials say the bodies were blindfolded and many had gunshot wounds to the back of the head. They're still trying to figure out who's responsible for this, of course. So what happens next with the Islamic State and Iraq? I want to bring back the red cell concept and apply it to the situation. Now, red cell is essentially a wargaming exercise. It's where we look at all kinds of scenarios and how they might play out. We're looking for high impact but low probability, particularly things that may happen, but if they do happen, they're going to make a very big difference. Now, this is a good way of viewing potential outcomes without knowing what is actually going to happen. We can't actually see the future, but let's look at what the possible futures are. Joining me to discuss this is American Enterprise Institute scholar Michael Rubin. He's the author of Dancing with the Devil, The Perils of Engaging Rogue Regimes. We appreciate him joining. Thank you, sir.
Hey, thank you, Buck.
Michael, let's start with one that I think very few people are actually assuming is going to happen, but it could happen, and that would be Baghdad actually falling, the capital city of Iraq with its 6 or 7 million people falling to the Islamic State. If that were to come about, what would be the follow-on situations that we would be facing?
That's one of the worst situations possible. The Islamic State has gotten a lot of low-hanging fruit, the so-called places you fly over, Mosul included, but it has yet to seize a national capital. If it seizes Baghdad, suddenly it's a whole new ballgame. You might have Iran get involved at that point, and remember, Iran has promised to protect the Shiite holy shrines. They're not just in Najaf and Karbala or Samarra. There's also the Qadamiyya shrine inside Baghdad, so this could set the whole region alight.
And what about a second scenario that we're looking at right now, and that would be that there is the establishment of a real state by the Islamic State, and they set up training camps and a general governing apparatus. They actually are providing services. They perhaps provide documentation to people to travel. But also as part of that, they have madrasas and they have jihadist training camps that could be used for attacks against the West, but haven't yet attacked the West. Do you think that we could essentially learn to coexist in some way with a jihadistan in between Iraq and Syria? Or what do you see happening if that, what is now a declared state, becomes an actual state with the Islamic State?
Well, to some extent, this is already starting to occur. The Islamic State has issued passports. It's issued license plates, but really the scenario you're talking about, Buck, is going back to the future and looking at pre-9/11 Afghanistan, where the Taliban had created their Islamic Emirate. If you have training camps, ultimately we have to be prepared for the fact that they will train, reach out, and attack us. After all, the terrorism isn't motivated by grievance. It's not that the Islamic State is simply upset with Maliki, and if Maliki goes, they will dissipate. Rather, they embrace a very offensive and aggressive ideology which brokers no room for dissent anywhere in the world. And indeed, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who's renamed himself the Caliph Ibrahim, has said, and I quote, "See you in New York."
Well, that brings us perfectly to our next scenario, a terrifying one for all of us here in the West. It's one that people are already saying is inevitable. It's a question of when, not if. And that would be a strike that is conducted against the West, a terrorist attack, but that was based out of, that was prepared for inside of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. What do you think would be the response to this? I mean, Michael, it would seem to me that if the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria was used as a launch pad for a terror attack against the West, you mentioned Afghanistan a minute ago, we might be in store for a third U.S. invasion of this part of the world. Is there any way around that? Do you think that they could just do aerial strikes? What is the U.S. response to a terror attack that is based out of the Islamic State?
Ultimately, the United States response would, in all likelihood, be some sort of military intervention back in the region. The reason is simple. If you create a space for these terrorists to thrive, they metastasize, and ultimately they will reach out and strike us. There's been some discussion in the past, for example, when we withdrew from Afghanistan and as we're withdrawing from, when we withdrew from Iraq and as we're withdrawing from Afghanistan, that we can provide security from over the horizon. But the fact that the Islamic State took us by surprise when their forces seized Mosul, Iraq's second largest city, is a sign that that simply doesn't work. Plus, without boots on the ground, you really don't have the actionable intelligence for some of our airstrikes to target Islamic State officials.
Now, here is a scenario that I know comes from you, and that is the possibility of Jordan, which is a buffer state in the region. It has not just Palestinian refugees and Iraqi refugees, but now Syrian refugees as well. That country, which is a U.S. ally, actually collapsing because of these pressures, because of the refugee pressure and also just the instability in the region. What happens if the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan disintegrates, it goes away, or fighting breaks out inside? If Jordan falls, what is next?
Well, Buck, you have to recognize that while the Islamic State's rhetoric is sectarian and they promise death to all Shiites, for example, most of the people who have been doing the dying in Iraq since they rose up have been the Sunnis. They really are the low-hanging fruit. The Islamic State's already on Jordan's borders. They've seized the border checkpoint. And make no mistake, while King Abdullah II of Jordan is very popular in the West, he's like Mikhail Gorbachev. He's much more popular outside his own country than within. I was just in Jordan earlier this week, and that was very, very clear. If Jordan should fall, that fundamentally redraws the Middle East in a way we haven't seen since World War II and shortly thereafter the creation of the State of Israel. Most of our policy is predicated on Jordan, and if the monarchy of Jordan falls, there's really little standing in the way for Saudi Arabia as well.
Now, one other scenario that I wanted to discuss with you is as we talk about the declaration of the Islamic State. Some I know are still referring to it as ISIS, although ISIS doesn't want to be referred to that way anymore. The possibility of declaration of a Kurdish state, something that we might actually encourage. What do you think happens if the Kurds take what is now considered a sort of de facto Kurdistan, make it official, try to turn to the international community and say, we want to be a separate country? Is that possibly something that the U.S. could think is a good idea? And also, how do the Turks respond?
Well, officially, the United States is urging the Kurds to stay inside Iraq. But, you know, the Kurds have a lot of fans in the United States. Generally, they're pro-American. And so certainly there's a lot of emotional support for them, especially since just 26 years ago, they were the subject of that horrendous Saddam Hussein gas attack on Halabja. Interestingly, the Turks, which have often opposed Kurdish statehood, have given a blessing to the Iraqi Kurds to succeed, although their blessing has limits. They don't want Turkey's Kurds, who are far more numerous, to join their Iraqi Kurds in independence. What's actually quite interesting, however, is in the last couple days, Iran's deputy foreign minister said under no circumstances would Iran allow Kurdish independence. Iran is worried about its own Kurdish minority as well. And so you could see a situation where the Americans would bless Kurdish independence, but then you have a proxy war develop inside the newly independent Kurdistan between Turkey and Iran. And that would mean not that Kurdistan would be a force for stability, but it could simply further some of the regional complexities.
All right, Michael Rubin.